Well, it's been a hot minute since I've done one of these worst to best. I think it's been over a year where I take an artist or a band and I take all of their studio albums and I say, which one do I like the most? Which one do I like the least? So the usual kind of caveats for this type of a video. The first off is I'm only looking at studio releases. I'm not looking at EPs. I'm not looking at compilations, and I'm not looking at live albums. Second one, I'm not going to be doing a full-length album review for any of these guys. These will just be kind of like justifications of where the album is within its discography, where the album sits within my kind of ranking system, but I'm not going to be doing like a full-fledged deep dive into the album. If you want to see, I have done a review for all these albums, so I'll link the list down below. So if you want to have like a more full-length album review, check it out down there. The final thing, the third piece, is just, this is my opinion. I am just saying, if I had all the albums spread out in front of me, which one would I listen to first and which one would I listen to last? That's kind of how I approach these kind of worst to best things. And I hope that is how you approach these worst to best things, rather than it being the be all and end all. And if you don't agree with my list, then you are capital R wrong. I do not subscribe to that whatsoever. So today we are talking about, of course, Ayreon kind of being the lead focus of Arjen Lucassen. This is such an interesting project to tackle. We've got 10 albums that we'll be tackling, and I almost feel like, this is kind of like an Alan Parsons or an Andrew Lloyd Webber concept record, because each record has a different plethora of musicians, different plethora of artists. So it's almost like it's a whole new band every time that you are diving into it. But Arjen Lucassen is always the mastermind behind it all. He writes all the music. He writes all the concepts. He leaves stretches for artists to come in and do their own thing, specifically in keyboardists and guitarists, to really like jam out on whatever section he's left for them. But for the most part, it's all him all the time. And, he will collaborate with different individuals to help round out certain songs. But yeah, he's kind of the mastermind. So talking about the 10 albums, studio albums from Mr. Arjen Lucassen with his Ayreon project, let's get things started with number 10. Number 10, The Final Experiment, released in 1995. This one's fairly early within the prog sphere, and I always hate starting off these, worst to best with the debut album, the first record. But yeah, The Final Experiment, it's fine. There's a lot of things that I really do enjoy and like about this record. It was the experiment. This was kind of seeing, could this work? And, we don't have the big heavy hitting prog acts or metal acts that we would get in the future. We don't have, the big metal or experimental side of things that Arjen would lock down in subsequent albums. And the concept itself is kind of fun. You've got, Arthur and Avalon. It's not quite as clear cut as some of the other concepts that we would get in the future. And I do feel as if this is kind of the shaking deer legs as it's traversing onto its first frozen pond. It lays down some of the foundation that would be trodden on later. Now, that's not to write off The Final Experiment completely. There's some charm to it. There's some quirky aspects that I really enjoy. But overall, this is the one that I probably listen to the least. So that's why it's at number 10. Number 9, Transitus, released in 2020. It's interesting, right? The first album and the last album. Transitus, it suffered from the legacy that was Ayreon. We just got off of the heels of, some really standout, really powerful, and really prominent records from the band, and this just fell flat, It's a unique story. It's very gothic in its approach. It came with its own comic book, and everything on the surface is something that I would love. I love gothic tales. I love romantic gothic tales. I love ghost stories. I love all that stuff. But the music that's found behind it doesn't quite bring it together. I was really hoping with this kind of tragic, star-crossed lover gothic tale that there would have been a lot more of an emotional core, and it just isn't felt, and because it's so divorced of the entire mythology of the Ayreon, the universal migrator, essentially, that it does suffer a little bit from that. And even with Tom Baker narrating most of this, this would have worked a lot better if this was just an Arjen Lucassen side project rather than, at this point, the final Ayreon album. And I know that there was kind of a little bit of push and pull going on when it was getting to that point of how do we market this record? Do we want it to be a side project? Do we want it to be an Ayreon project? And I think if they had just stuck with an Arjen side project, like, the new real, like Enter the New Reality or Enter the New Real, which I personally love, I think we would have gotten a little bit of a better record if that were the case, because the guest appearances on this aren't my favorite. The music that surrounds it isn't my favorite. It's fun. I will admit that it's a fun record to listen to, but Arjen has done much better stuff in the past. So that's what I've got for Transitus, and that's why it's at number 9. Number 8, Universal Migrator Part 2, Flight of the Migrator. So I split up, the Universal Migrator Part 1 and 2 just to give the full 10, because I didn't want Part 1 to be, decreased in value, and I didn't want Universal Migrator Part 2 to be lifted up, because, this record is rough. This is within the whole Universal Migrator Part 1 and 2, Ayreon really did separate the two ideologies of the band. You had Part 1 being very proggy, and Part 2 being very metal. And I just felt as if the proggy aspects were a little bit stronger. And both of these records are much more episodic in nature. Like, unlike all of the other concept records, which follows a narrative flow, this one is kind of like vignettes of stories, And within the Universal Migrator Part 2, Flight of the Migrator, we're going through the timelines, We're going right before the creation of the universe and trying to figure out, even before souls, what was the universe like? Even without consciousness, what was the universe like? And musically, it's a very interesting idea to lay over this very prog metal album, but I don't return to this one quite as much as I do Part 1. I just feel as if it's a little bit more lost. And I know that's part of the, concept of the actual record itself, but it seems a little bit more aimless. There's not a lot of grounding on it, unlike Part 1, which has these really catchy and really memorable moments. Even within some of the more metal, noodly guitar and solo aspects, I don't feel myself as drawn to it. They don't have that same amount of perch on it. But that being said, it's still a rockin' record. I still love the energy of this record. I love the drive of this record. I love the intensity of this record. This is probably the most metal that we've ever got from start to finish for a record from Ayreon. And as I mentioned, it works both in its favor and its drawbacks. So even though it's at, number 8, there's still stuff that's really fun about this record, and I would still recommend this record, especially if you are into that more energetic power metal side of things. I think you'll really enjoy this one. But for me, I tend not to listen to it. So that's Universal Migrator Part 2, Flight of the Migrator at number 8. Number 7, Actual Fantasy, released in 1996. Actual Fantasy, sophomore record. I know a lot of people don't like this record, and I mean, it's still on this side of the halfway mark. I have an interesting relationship with this record. It still hasn't quite nailed down the quintessential Ayreon sound. I think that will be in the next album that he releases. But within the Actual Fantasy, the concept's strange, and I love it. The music is quirky, and I love it. And there's just this strangeness about it that I really like. And for some people that turns them off, it's just a little too weird. But for me, there's enough tangibility on here. There's enough oomph on it. And there's so many memorable moments from this record. I don't know if it quite overshines the duds on this record, because there are quite a few of them, but I still enjoy where this album goes. And, there's a number, as I mentioned, memorable moments on it. He still has a long way to go, but it's definitely not the worst, in my opinion. So, I don't really have too much more to say about this record. And I think at the end of the day, that's why this record, for me, is ranked so low on this list, because I don't have all that much more to say about it. So, that's Actual Fantasy at the 7th spot. Number 6, The Source, released in 2017. Yeah, The Source is an interesting one. The Source was the first record of Ayreon that I got to review upon its release. It's a follow-up to 01011001, and I was really looking forward to it. There's some really prominent players on this one. You have Tommy Rogers from Between the Buried and Me on here. You've got James LeBray, I believe, makes an appearance on here. And then you have, of course, the collection of usual suspects on here as well. This was the first record from Ayreon that I felt a little disappointed with, and then, of course, we would get Transitus after that I was just like, womp womp. But at least with the story, it's a prequel. It's where the whole alien race that has been talked about endlessly within all these records, their home planet, how they rose to power, and how they decided to sow their seeds across the universe, and how they set their sights on Earth, and kind of like what brought them to that moment, what got them into essentially shoving off and shaving off their physical form and just going into this ethereal, out-of-body consciousness, essentially. And it's interesting, and there are some moments on here that I always come back to, Run, Apocalypse Run is the most catchy track off of here, but I don't know, I don't find myself coming back to it. And after I digested it off of the first leg of it, every time I come back to it, I don't really feel anything. Even though the story is interesting, the music is interesting, I feel as if, ironically, this is the most cerebral record of Ayreon, even though this was the follow-up to The Theory of Everything, which is probably the most. But I don't know, it just didn't quite click with me. So, yeah, I would say that it's much better than all the albums that I had mentioned prior, just because of how these lists work. But, I don't know, I think that there's still quite a bit of, oomph and good stuff that are going to become. With that being said, this is one of the heavier records. This is one of the more drive-in records. And if you like that style, I think you'll really enjoy this record. But for me, I don't know. I was expecting just a little bit more, and a little bit more of that really big powerhouse, those really big crescendos and the big oomph about it. And I was also kind of hoping for a little bit more of a callback to 01, but that's what you get. So anyway, that's The Source. That's why it's at number 6. Let's go into the top 5, starting with number 5. The Universal Migrator Part 1, The Dream Sequencer. The proggiest, well, almost, of Ayreon records. This was the direct follow-up to Into the Electric Castle, and this was when we got some really good big names, kind of help fleshing out and filling out the runtime, We have Neil Morse with The First Man on Earth. Love so many tracks off of this record. I really, really do. The Druids Turn to Stone, My House on Mars being another one, One Small Step. I wouldn't necessarily call this one a perfect record quite yet. There are still a few tracks on here that do dip a little bit within the quality. 2084, Shooting Company of the Captain, blah, 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 blah. They're fine, but I do feel as if they do dip a little bit within the quality. That being said, I still love those big oomph tracks. It follows this whole Universal Migrator. As I did mention within the Flight of the Migrator, it's much more episodic than it is kind of narrative. It's very much vignettes. It's like, here's this moment, here's that moment, here's that moment. And it does, kind of, I don't want to say ruin the flow, but it does kind of mess up the flow a little bit for me. It's much more a collection of pieces of music rather than an album that, Ayreon really loves to construct. That being said, it's still a fantastic album, and I highly recommend this one. This is like where we're getting into the good stuff. Ayreon hasn't really put out a bad record. This is where we're getting into good stuff. So, yeah, that's Universal Migrator. That's my number 5 point. Let's go into number 4. Number 4, The Theory of Everything, released in 2013. This is what a treat. This is definitely the most proggy of all of the albums that he has released thus far. It's also one of the few that doesn't follow the whole Universal Migrator kind of storyline. Now, it could be argued that, the whole out-of-body extraterrestrial presence or within the drugs or within the inspiration or all within that kind of aspect of it. But they don't take center stage. The storyline is much more cerebral. It's a At the end of the day, I think it's much more of the relationship between the father, son, and the rival, all trying to compete to find the theory of everything. It's very Amadeus. It's very Oppenheimer in that, these extremely intellectual individuals with their passionate pursuit of being the first. And yeah, it slaps. It's a banger. I absolutely love it. I love the whole relationship between, humans and drugs, and where they can benefit, where they hinder, the dangers of it, the danger of pursuits. Even though I love the actual storyline, for me, where this album really shines is the underlining themes. And the music is absolutely to die for. We have huge names from the prog sphere, like Keith Emerson, like Jordan Rudess, like Steve Hackett, and they're all clumped together. I also love that this album is really divided into 4 20-minute pieces of music. I do not subscribe to the whole, 2-minute little chunks here and there. Nah. This is a 4-track album, very similar to Tales of Topographic Ocean from Yes. The only downside I will say from this are track 2 and 3, the 2 mid tracks. They do dip a little bit within the quality in terms of music, but the story, the characters, the themes, at least elevate it a little bit more. Because still, the first track and the last track for me are the big epics, and that's what I particularly love about this record. So I will stop gushing about the theory of everything. I'll leave it there. That's why it's my 4th choice. And let's move on to number 3. Number 3, Into the Electric Castle, released in 1998. I almost said 1999. Into the Electric Castle. This was his 3rd record, and this is still his most successful record, I think. There's a reason for that. As I was mentioning, I don't know, I'm pretty sure it hasn't been released yet. This is the one that takes the What a Concept episode 3. Ian and I from Rhyme Signatures go really deep into this record, so I'm not going to go too deep, but in 1998, there really wasn't anything like this. This one really took the world by storm in terms of being big, progressive concept, double discer. It was everything that I loved about progressive rock. I'm not the ride or die that I know a lot of people are on this. I think that there are a few peaks and valleys that could have been shaved off a little bit. This is a little bit too long in terms of the story, but the story is quirky. We get introduced to that whole universal migrator, the whole alien thing, playing with humanity in that sense. And it lays down the groundwork for what Ayreon will be going forward. The first 2 records were the training wheels. This one is him taking the training wheels off and just going for it. And it really does succeed. I think this is one of the best, as I mentioned. And it also features Fish, one of the big prominent neo-prog artists ever. And for Ayreon to get such a big name and to start that whole, I'm going to get the big singers, the big players within the prog sphere at that time and put them on this record, that started the trend. Nobody else was doing that. So I absolutely love that. This was kind of the genesis. This was the real start of it. And you couldn't have asked for a better record. So that's why we got it at number 3. We still got 2 more left. So when I reveal what number 2 is, you're going to obviously know what number 1 is just through process of elimination. So let's talk about number 2 first. Number 2, 010110001, or Planet Y, released in 2008. So full disclosure before I gush about this record, this was my first record from Ayreon. This was my introduction. I remember when it first dropped in 2008, and I remember taking this album and Andy Tillison's The Tangent, Not As Good As the Book. I bought both of them on the same day. I went up to the family cottage, and I just listened to those 2 records over and over and over again. And this was the record that I loved more than the other one. I just could not stop listening to it. I love the concept. I love the themes. I love how metal this record is. There are many moments on this record that I'd heard something that I'd never heard before. Beneath the Waves, with the 2 harmonies that were going on, I had never heard anything like that before. The solos that we would get with Liquid Eternity and E=MC² and The Sixth Extinction, they just, again, I had never heard anything like that before. It's powerful, it's proggy, it's metal, and I absolutely adore this. This is one of the albums that I come back to time and time and time again, just because of how much I absolutely adore it. Yeah, it really started my experience with Ayreon with a bang. I love how dark the themes are within this, the futility and the inevitability of life, and the oncoming onslaught of death, and what we will go through to try to make an imprint about that, what we are doing to both aid and hinder that. I absolutely love this record. It's, yeah. For me, it's one of the few perfect records out there. There's nothing on this record that I can sniff about, and it's so interesting. The reason why I found out about this record is because Fido makes a very small cameo on Web of Lies, the shortest track off of this record. And when I found out that he was, had a small bit part on it, I'm like, I gotta listen to it. Fido at that time was my favorite artist. He put out some of my favorite records, and I'm like, I have to listen to it. And it really did open up the door for Ayreon. And then I went back and I listened to everything. So yeah, this one, I would start here. But there was one more album that I love even more. So let's talk about that one. Number 1, The Human Equation, released in 2004. Talk about an all-time absolute masterpiece of a record. This one, I think, is the peak. It's the pinnacle of what Ayreon is trying to do with his project. Collaborate with as many big names within the prog sphere, within the prog metal sphere, as you possibly can. You've got James LeBray. You have Michael Eckefelt from Opeth. You have Devin Townsend. You have Anna, oh boy, here we go. Anna Gershenbergen. I'm so sorry, Annika. Annika Gershenbergen. You have Heather Finley from Mostly Autumn. You have Irene Jensen from Karma. You have Eric Clayton. You have, the list goes on and on and on and on. And it's as I mentioned, one of the most perfect albums. The concept of it is so brilliant. It's basically Inside Out but put to prog metal. Each emotion that this character is trying to work through after committing suicide, or is it a suicide, trying to figure out why he did it, and because he can't quite remember why he did it, going through his past, going through his memories, and basically this therapy session of this character. And it's a perfect record, and the music is top notch. The solos that are found within it, the big moments on here. There are so many big crescendo moments that I just absolutely gush about. This is the pinnacle, as I mentioned. You don't get better than this. If you were to start anywhere, I would start here. This is the masterpiece. This is the magnum opus. I absolutely love it. Absolute masterpiece. And I can't get enough of it. So there are all 10 records ranked from worst to best. What would your list look like? How does it compare to mine? Which ones was I right about? Which ones were I wrong about? Let me know all about that by commenting down below. I'm very interested to hear what your top 5 Ayreon records are. I'm very tempted to hear what your least favorite Ayreon records are. Again, let me know all about that. This was a lot of fun. Thank you guys for indulging me on this. I've been meaning to make another worst to best. I've been dragging my feet, and yeah, it takes a little bit of time because I want to really dive in and re-listen to all these records. And even with 10 records, it takes a little bit of time. So anyway, that's my thoughts. That's all I've got for you guys today. I'm going to end with thanking you all so much for watching. If you've gotten this far, please like, subscribe, comment, engage, share it around. That would really help me out. And yeah, so thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.